I'm glad you're here tonight. I kind of wondered if we were losing big, if anyone would show up, and now I see we have a marvelous gathering. I'm Clay Brown, in case you're wondering who this person is. I think most of you I know, all of you I know, I believe, and I'm subbing for Lorian tonight, who is in the beginning part of her doctoral program. So I'm very excited for her, glad that she's taking that program under her wing at Houston Christian University. Also, Houston Theological Seminary is the name of the seminary affiliated with the former Houston Baptist University. So I'm very pleased for her, happy for her, glad I could step in, and I'm glad I got a really easy topic to talk about. I think it's appropriate to begin with prayer and then see if there are any announcements we need to make, and then just launch into it and go from there. Handouts are on the tables. Food is on that table to my right, your left. You've been coming here long enough where you know where that is, and you know where the restrooms are, you know where all of it is. So let's start with prayer. Lord God, thank you for allowing us to gather here, and we're grateful for your love and goodness. We are grateful for the opportunity to think about things that challenge us, that stretch us, that puzzle us. We know that growth comes through that process. And so we ask that you'll help us as we attempt to understand a little better what naturalism and existentialism are and how they have made an impact on the world in which we live, and what we are to do with regard to them. So, through your Holy Spirit, give us wisdom and insight. This we ask through the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, well, let me set up my device here. That's a little better. You may not be able to see this from where you are, but this is a philosophy book catalog that I received in today's mail from the good folks at Roman and Littlefield. And I received it because, if I may sort of toot my own horn for a moment, I am a member of the American Philosophical Association. That and 75 cents enabled me to have the soft drink that I had a moment ago up here. So I'm not exactly one of their fine upstanding members, but I am a member, and thus my name gets sold to various and sundry establishments. And this Roman and Littlefield has a number of new books, it says, on philosophy. And as you might wonder, well, why would anyone get one of these books? Well, there's generally marketed to college professors who are trying to teach on this, but just to help you, all the kinds of topics that those of a philosophical mindset talk about. You have such things as ethics, such categories as epistemology, that's the study of knowledge, how we know what we know, the philosophy of religion. I know it will surprise you to learn that there are several books on gender and sexuality. I mean, no one's talking about that today. But just a number of things going on here so that there's a market for at least some people to buy books like this. We're going to get into some of the philosophical weeds tonight. Hopefully, with our weed eater, clear it out just a little bit to where it's not quite as thick and dense as it might have been. But also, in addition to just trying to understand what they're talking about with naturalism or materialism and existentialism, but how are we Christians supposed to respond to this? And so my handout hopefully will help in this regard. And just to let you know, I am not doing my usual 3 points. And I know that saddens some of you, but there's I have an introduction and then a response about naturalism or materialism with regard to the 8 basic questions that our book uses for each worldview that it's talking about. And then the implications of them, the serious implications that lead us to nihilism. And then I've got if you remember, Nancy Pearcey was here. But then I have a quote from one of Nancy Pearcey's books that I think will unpack some of this for us and make it a little clearer. And then I'm going to talk about atheistic existentialism. I'm not really going to talk about the theistic existentialism. It's too close to theism, quite frankly. There are some differences, and if you want to ask questions from the floor about that, well, I'll be happy to attempt to address them, but I'd rather spend more time talking about the atheistic side of that. And then I want to put before you, I don't know if you've received this information or not, but I think it's helpful. How do we evaluate any worldview? I've got some questions that I personally use as I'm thinking about these things, and then kind of my sum total evaluation that I have an idea will be already pretty clear by the time we get to that point. But anyway, that's where we're going, and I think that's a roadmap for our time tonight. And we'll stop and take questions. With that, the mic is on the table, and Kelly, I designate thee as the keeper of the microphone. Blessed art thou among people. So we'll take questions at various points along this. So let me begin, as is always helpful, with the introduction. I found putting introductions at the beginning to be most fruitful. So what are we talking about tonight? We are talking about naturalism, which is also called materialism, and I like that name better, actually. Both terms get confused for other things, which is why you find them being bandied back and forth. Naturalism makes me think sometimes of people that others call nudists. Naturalists prefer to go around without clothing, and that's just, those are visual images that cannot be removed from one's brain after one contemplates them. But naturalism is a name a lot of people, and a name that our book from Jim Sire calls it. But it's also called materialism, and I think that's a little better name, even though it also gets confused with the school of thought that says, well, it's all about money. It's all about material possessions. That kind of materialism is a part of the larger materialism that we're going to unpack. But to be quite frank, naturalism, materialism, that's where many of our friends are, even if they don't fully realize it, and even if they don't fully live consistently according to it. In fact, it's really hard to be a consistent, hardcore materialist. It's just difficult for reasons that I think will be clear as we talk, and may have already become clear to you as you read the chapter. So that's why, then, we get into nihilism, or nihilism. I've heard it pronounced both ways. To my knowledge, you're not incorrect either way, but I usually say nihilism. Because nihilism is really what a well-rounded, fully orbed materialism ends up looking like. A materialism that does what it says it's going to do ends up being very nihilistic. And I hope we see that as we talk about it. And then trying to figure out some way to rescue materialism or naturalism, you get into existentialism. And so we are going to talk about existentialism beyond what the Seattle Mariners are attempting to deal with now for their problem. The Mariners are going to be attempting, I think, to sort of create their own decision-making and create a new person for themselves in Game 2. Our desire is that they don't succeed at that. So existentialism, though, in its atheistic perspective still falls short in my assessment of what's needed to rescue materialism. And therefore, even though naturalism leads a lot of the cultural conversations, right, it's sort of the assumed underpinning worldview with a lot of people in today's world, postmodernism has come up in the past, say, 30, 40 years to try and fix a lot of what is wrong with naturalism. Someone else will have to unpack that. I think you have another talker, another speaker who will be doing that. I think it's Alf. I would have to look to be sure. And so I'm going to agree with whatever he says. I generally agree with what he says, but that's what, I'll let him unpack postmodernism for you, because it is in some ways another reaction to materialism. Because materialism sounds wonderful until you start thinking about it. And when you start thinking about it, and when you begin to see the flaws, the issues, the problems, it, in my mind, becomes non-rescuable. There's just no way to fix it sufficiently. All right. The 8 questions. I love the 8 questions from James Sire. They're good questions to try and get at the heart of whatever any worldview is talking about. It'll be really helpful as you dig into the other worldviews you're going to encounter in this portion of the Institute. Just to repeat the questions: what is prime reality, the really real? What is the nature of external reality? What is the world around us? What is a human being? What happens to a person at death? Why is it possible to know anything at all? How do we know what is right and wrong? What is the meaning of human history? And then the last one, which the question number 8 is a pretty new addition. This is he's had several versions of these, and this is a later edition than the book I grew up reading. What personal, life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview? All right, here we go. What is prime reality for the materialist, for the naturalist? Sounds really simple until you start trying to unpack it. Nature for the naturalist, matter for the materialist. The physical cosmos. Did you catch the Carl Sagan reference in the textbook? The cosmos is all there is and ever will be. Yeah. But that's really for materialism. Everything starts from this premise. Everything starts from what I have here is the only real thing, and other things like it, the only reality around. Anything that I can't in some way observe, measure, quantify, deal with on a physical level isn't real, is made up. You realize, of course, that means love isn't real. I haven't found a laboratory experiment to do love yet, that measures, quantifies love. So for the naturalist, their ground zero, their beginning point is, if it's physical and I can see it and observe it, that's what's real. Nothing else is real. Only what I can touch, only what I can measure, only what in some way I can observe with my senses. There are a lot of begged questions in that, but let's go on to the nature, the second point, the nature of external reality. It's a closed system. The naturalist says, if it's all just about what we see and what we're able to measure and put mathematical equations for and in some way have some kind of scientific evidence for, then nothing can enter into this system from outside. It's completely closed. which is the opposite, by the way, of supernaturalism. Supernaturalism holds that God is outside the system and is able to enter into the system at his desire. But for the naturalist, for the materialist, nothing can intrude this closed system that has been established by what we can see and touch and measure. And it's a system that operates by cause and effect. And we get this all the time. I drive too fast on the Beltway. Cause. The effect, I get pulled over by a constable and get a ticket. We see this kind of relationship between things all the time. It's really one of the primary ways of understanding behavior, understanding the practice of anything, is cause and effect. Naturalism, materialism, love cause and effect. There is no effect that doesn't have a cause. If you find an uncaused effect, then you've blown up naturalism. What is a human being? Here's a really good one. Human beings, and you've probably heard this from other sources, human beings are really machines. Complex machines, to be sure, but machines. Meat puppets is one way to put it. And that our personalities, what we know as personality, what we observe in others as personality, and what we observe within ourselves as consciousness, is all part of biochemical responses. My body doing what my body does. In some way that I can't fully figure out yet. We haven't figured out consciousness, human beings with some way of transcending their ordinary existence. But the materialist will say it's because certain brain signals are firing in certain ways. So an experience after death is because the electrical system in your brain went haywire. That's the automatic assumption. So we are machines. And there's what mentioned one of the original French philosophers who talks about cogs and wheels and all that with human beings. There's still a lot of that understanding in materialism that we are the sum total of what our body does, and we don't transcend what our body does. Robots is often the terminology used today. What happens to you at death? Well, nothing. You simply cease to be. You don't exist. One of the saddest statements I ever read, I can remember reading, was Carl Sagan's wife on his death. He's gone, and that was pretty much it. I don't have any hope of ever seeing him again or ever making any kind of contact. He has gone the way of all flesh, and that ends it, as it will end for me. I was depressed after reading that. So what happens at death is that death just ends it for us. Now, why is it possible to know anything at all? That's a great question from James Sire. And the materialist will say, well, it's human reason, human logic, humans' ability to observe and to measure. That's why we're able to know something rather than nothing. Because we have the reasonable capacities to be able to observe and to make sense of information. How do we know what's right and wrong? Well, the old-time materialist way was human decisions and constructs. In other words, ethics is a human creation. There's nothing transcendent about ethics, which makes sense. If you have a closed system and nothing can get in, well then right and wrong becomes at some point just human choices. But there's a newer option out there in the materialist worldview. My gene pool, the evolutionary biology behind my gene pool. And so whatever helps my gene pool to survive and thrive, that's what's good. And whatever works against that is bad. So that's a relatively late comer into all this. But that's gained traction. 7, what is the meaning of human history? Linked by cause and effect. Yeah, we see Russia invades Ukraine. Ukraine fights back. We see cause and effect in human history, but there's not really any overarching purpose to any of the things we note in history. They just simply are. And whenever human beings cease to be, stop acting, then history will stop. There's no rhyme or reason to it, no greater plan that's being fulfilled. And then the last thing, what personal life-orienting core commitments? You don't really need one, but you can have any of them, actually, almost, as long as they're not theistic. You can be a fascist, you can be a communist, you can be a libertarian, you can have all kinds of life ordering and core convictions that are not required to be a materialist. Now, it's in the consideration of the implications of what I just said about naturalism that we begin to see the problems of naturalism. One of the implications is that if the universe is closed and all that exists is simply physical matter, and I am not created with any kind of purpose behind me, but just a random accident, in a sense, that happened as somewhere that my gene pool won the lottery, and I made it, then it's hard for me to think that I really have free will, because there are so many things impacting me that I simply don't know of. So many pre-existing determining factors. And that makes some sense when you think about it. For example, why do I have a temper? Well, some of it is the way I was raised. I had an older brother with a temper, and you may be going, you have a temper? I do. I particularly if, I know I mentioned this a lot, but particularly when I'm driving on the Beltway. I yell at people. That some of that was by my associations with my family. And that's only the parts of that I realize, that I recognize. There are so many things that determine my behavior that I'm not even aware of, that there's simply no way to catalog them all, and there's no way to unpack them all. And so for me to say that, I am a free moral agent in light of that, in light of all of the influences on me over which I don't even have a clue, well, you can't. That's one of the big problems with naturalism. That it talks big about human beings having free choice and human beings doing the right things and choosing to do this and that and the other, but in the end, it really comes down to what my biology has predetermined me to do. And not just my biology, but your biology operating on me. And that the things that we bump up against one another, we just simply can't understand all of the influences on us. And so to say that we have the ability to choose, that we have the ability to make free moral choices, is really a misstatement for naturalism. In other words, we are robots, according to naturalism, like it or not. We're programmed in certain ways, we operate in certain ways, we respond to certain stimuli in certain ways, and B.F. Skinner, the great determinist psychologist, would say, all you got to do, the right set of stimuli produce the right effect that you're looking for. That's one of the problems of naturalism. The second serious implication here that comes from the 8 question answers is that if our minds originated by this random process, why should I trust anything it's come up with? What makes me likely to come up with something good, something worthwhile? In fact, how would I even have a category of good or worthwhile to put that in? If it's all random, maybe the people who made the Matrix movies were right. And we're all just plugged into a set of computers somewhere and playing out the computer program of our alien overlords. I know that sounds ridiculous, but, well, cause it is. But the idea that we are able to trust our minds is a big hole in naturalism, because the only reason we can say that is because we have no alternative. I mean, if you don't trust the decisions and the observations of your mind, then how are you going to make it through life? What are you going to do? You got to do something. And so our de facto response to that dilemma is simply to ignore that it exists, because we couldn't get out of bed in the morning otherwise. It's really a problem for materialism, that we can't be certain about anything of substance, anything that matters. Because how do I know, when I got my philosophy catalog from the book publishers, how do I know that I'm really picking this up and I'm touching it, and that I'm reading it, and that maybe this is just a dream? Maybe somehow my neurons are misfiring. I really don't have any proof of that. You may say, well, we'll record it. Okay, well, the process that your mind picked up to record something, it may be just as flawed as mine. And what keeps you from being in the same trap that I'm in? It's really not much fun, is it? So that's 2 things. We are robots, and we can't know anything for certain that matters. It gets worse. There are no moral absolutes of any kind. And all we have to go by are ultimately preferences. So everything is permissible, because there is no outside standard. There is no objective measurement. It's permissible if we can get away with it. That should strike fear into us. Naturalism has been borrowing on the Christian worldview for a number of centuries in this regard. And there are many naturalists who have sterling ethical standards. But there's no reason in naturalism to have those ethical standards. You may say, I'm going to use Kelly again. Kelly, you may say that, Clay, I don't want you to take my phone. Because I've come up to you and said, that's really a great phone. I want it. And Kelly said, well, no, I don't want it. It's wrong. Why? It's your preference that I don't take it, but what objective measurement do you have? What objective standard do you have that says that's wrong? Most naturalists will say, well, society would fall apart if we all did that. Well, that's true, but that's a preference. That's a preference that we don't want society to fall apart. Maybe I want society to fall apart. Maybe I'm an anarchist, and I want there to be no rules. I want it to be, whatever I can come up with, whoever gets the most wins. Maybe I prefer that. So, if you're a full-blown naturalist, you have really no reason other than societal pressures or human conventions to tell me that's wrong. And you may decide to force me not to take Kelly's phone, but the reason you're doing that is really your preference for a lack of conflict between Kelly and myself. Materialism's hard. And then the last one. There are few people, if any, who can live consistently by this. And so we are forced into ongoing dualities. I think one way, I live another way. And perpetual cognitive dissonance. And I'm going to give an example of this in greater detail, but that really plays this out, that Nancy Piercy shared with us when she was here. None of us can make it through the day living consistently by naturalism or materialism. You can't. There's something within us that says, no, you can't do that. All right, let me open the floor for questions now. And so, Kelly, you are the great keeper of the mic. Are there any questions you want to ask on what I've said so far? Or you want me to unpack it more and get into existentialism or whatever? So any questions you have? All right. Mickey.
Yeah, I think one of the philosophers who thought the most about this and wrote the most about this was Nietzsche, and he called it post-Christian, post-Christian world, and put some structure to it, and in so doing, he went crazy.
Yeah, that most of the people, Nietzsche is one of those who attempted to live out the implications of there is no God, and it's all just simply a matter of matter, and he gets in the insane asylum. Do I say that everyone who does that will go to the insane asylum? No, but Nietzsche is a pretty prominent example of someone who attempted to face up to the implications of not only there is no God, but there is no standard set of morals, there is no purpose for life, there is no underpinning anything for what we're doing, and we're just playing out the string. That's about as hopeless as it gets. All right, any other questions? Carolyn, were you raising your hand? Kelly, you got to be quick.
Now? So most ordinary people, let's just say like me, if I didn't believe in God or was an atheist, would I really sit around and categorize myself this way and try to live this point by point? Or is this just more at the academic level, trying to sort through different ways that people might look at things?
That's a good question. And the question, I'll attempt to repeat it, and if I'm misstating it, Carolyn, let me know. How do ordinary people just wouldn't come up with this on their own? Typical people like us. And so is this just an academic exercise for people in the ivory tower? To a certain extent, yes, to play out the implications of it. But in a larger way, this all came about as people were looking for any reason not to buy into the God hypothesis. But how can I construct a manner of life that doesn't need God? Well, part of the way I do that is I close off the system so that there is no need for God. There is no way a God can enter into any of life as we know it. And you start going from there. And so I think that's a big reason that the motivation is to come up with a way of living that does not need a creator and a sustainer. It doesn't need a designer. You don't need any of that. I mean, that's my candid opinion of this. Jim.
When I read this, the author admits that he's a Christian theist, and that's why he puts that first. But it seems to me he then describes most of the rest of these through a filter of being a Christian theist and uses phrases like descend into nihilism and fix...
Uses phrases like what?
Descend.
Okay.
He says descend into nihilism, whatever that means, or fix materialism. And as I go through some of it, which of course very little of it do I understand, but there are things in those that I perfectly well can accept. Like the idea of effect with no cause just doesn't make sense to me. But that doesn't, I don't think that makes me a materialist.
No, that doesn't. It's not that every single thing in the materialist worldview is absolutely wrong. It wouldn't have lasted for these hundreds of years if that had been the case. Now, I think our author's pretty clear from the get-go that he is writing this from a Christian theist perspective. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so he's going to be attempting to assess these worldviews by that perspective. And historically speaking, he would argue that the theistic worldview came before materialism and all of the other worldviews, or at least was at the same time. You can argue world religions may be a different category, but the philosophical side of it, he would argue that they, in many ways, the materialists were responding to a Christian worldview when they came up with materialism over the decades and centuries. And they started with deism. That was the first start. Okay, we can have a God, but the God doesn't do anything. He has sort of got everything going and then abandons it and pulls back from it. And that was sort of the first step for naturalism, was deism. You don't find any deists around anymore. They were around a lot at the beginning of the American Revolution. We had a lot of them as part of the American fabric, but now not so much because that's moved on. But yes, so Jim, I think you're right. And I think it's correct to say that there are a number of things about materialism, naturalism, that, for example, I want science to include observation. That's just a component of science that it absolutely has to have for it to be able to do anything. The Christian worldview is not against science in any way, shape, or form. Okay. Oh, we need a microphone.
You're welcome, Kelly.
Oh, that's what. Yeah, that's what. Yeah, Kelly's getting off easy here.
Okay, this may be just a matter of just wordplay or whatever, but I guess I don't really understand. Couldn't you call, like Carl Sagan, just an agnostic scientist or an atheist scientist? Is there anything different than just calling him that versus a naturalist? I mean, what's the difference in saying someone is extremely scientific and he's an atheist? Is that just a more specific thing? I don't really, or am I just,
Well, I guess one response would be it is possible to be an atheist without being a materialist. You could be an atheist
and not really dig science?
and not buy in. So it's the term materialism or naturalism expresses the underlying philosophy behind why Carl Sagan is an atheist in his case. So I think that it's certainly not incorrect to say Carl Sagan was an atheistic scientist.
So would it be correct to say science is God as a naturalist? That you sort of put
They
the
wouldn't say that.
scientific world ahead of everything? I'm trying to just
That-
boil
yeah,
it
that would
down in a
be-
way that I can
that
understand a
might
little.
be our assessment of what they're doing, but they wouldn't say that.
Okay.
A naturalist would not say. A naturalist would say there's no need for God at all.
Okay, I
And so
know.
we're not making science a God. We're not
Right.
making anything a God
Right.
because there's not a God.
I know. I mean, with
I
a
kn-
small
I know,
g.
but that would be kind of our assessment of
Right.
it, of what they're really doing, in the same way that Marxism declared that it was not religious.
Right.
And it has all these elements of religious worldview.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, I have a second quick question.
Okay.
Well, I know we didn't really study nihilism this week, but the book talked about naturalism going into
Mm-hmm.
nihilism, and I don't really understand. Can you just sum it up quickly? Like how nihilism is basically the absence of everything. So how is naturalism even closely related to nihilism?
Because, and this is where the four implications that I mentioned on my
Yes,
handout
yes.
are all in the section on nihilism. I didn't make them up. I got them right out of the chapter on nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
They are a nihilistic response to what naturalism has done and is doing. The idea that if nihilism is the denial of any worldview, well, it's a denial of human agency to say that we're completely programmed, and we don't recognize it, we don't see it, and that we are we're trusting our minds when we have no idea how our minds came to be, and have no reason to trust them, and that there are no moral absolutes because all we have are just simply preferences if the other two things before that I said were true. And those are all nihilistic responses. So
it was
nihilism was
basically
an
just
organized,
another
yeah.
Like just a swing.
It
from-
is the people who try to live a full-fledged materialism or naturalism end up being nihilistic, because they simply it's the response and that's why existentialism comes, because the materialists, a lot of the materialists see the train coming down the track and saying we gotta fix this, we gotta deal with this. But yeah, so I would urge you to read the chapter on nihilism. As I was working on this, thinking, oh gosh, it'd been great if they had read it. But then I said, well, I can put myself off as having originated these 4 points as being the product of my thought. But now I can't do that because I've confessed to you that I simply pulled them from the chapter. Pat asked if I really have thought, and I'm not sure. And neither are you. Nancy Piercy was here last year, and she offered a lot of food for thought. But here's about how we unmask atheism, secularism, and other God substitutes. The title of her book, Finding Truth. I have a few paragraphs from her book related to one particular naturalist named Edward Slingerland. That's really his name, I checked. He's a professor at University of British Columbia. And let me just read this aloud, because I think it's a fascinating way of one person's attempt to deal with the contradictions in his or her worldview. And it may open us up to how we all do that. In What Science Offers the Humanities, Edward Slingerland identifies himself as an unabashed materialist and reductionist. Slingerland argues that Darwinian materialism leads logically to the conclusion that humans are robots, that our sense of having a will or self or consciousness is an illusion. That's a core tenet of materialism. There is no soul. Yet, he admits, it is an illusion we find impossible to shake. No one can help acting like and at some level really feeling that he or she is free. And these are quotes from his book. We are constitutionally incapable of experiencing ourselves and other conspecifics, an interesting term for humans, other humans as robots. One section of his book is even titled, "We Are Robots Designed Not to Believe That We Are Robots." Well, that's what, see, that begs a lot of questions there, doesn't it? He said, designed by who? And Piercy says, do you recognize the language of general revelation? It consists in those fundamental truths that humans can't help experiencing and feeling, even when those truths contradict their own worldview. In one passage, Slingerland writes, we are constituted in such a way that we unavoidably and inescapably, his words, experience the lived reality of being moral agents. As a Darwinist and materialist, he acknowledges that his reductionist view of humans as essentially robots is contrary to ordinary experience. So the way we ordinarily experience life, we don't experience ourselves as robots. It is alien and often repugnant from any sort of normal human perspective. At an important and ineradicable level, the idea of my daughter as merely a complex robot carrying my genes into the next generation is both bizarre and repugnant to me. Such a reductionistic view inspires in us a kind of emotional resistance and even revulsion. Indeed, he writes, if you do not feel that revulsion, something is wrong with you, which begs the question, why? Hard to argue that from a materialist perspective. There well may be individuals who lack this sense and who can quite easily and thoroughly conceive of themselves and other people in purely instrumental, mechanistic terms. But we label such people psychopaths and quite rightly try to identify them and put them away somewhere to protect the rest of us. What can we say when someone urges us to adopt a view of humanity that he himself admits is bizarre and repugnant, a view that ought to inspire revulsion, a view so dangerous that when acted on, it would justify us in labeling people psychopaths and locking them up? There is a severe clash between what his Darwinian materialism tells him and what his lived experience tells him. The problem with materialism is that it really can't be lived. It is unlivable. Well, many in the materialistic way who were looking at life that way began to feel, they felt this internally within the constraints of their own worldview and said, "What? This can't be. Something has to be done." Existentialism, the atheistic version, comes out of this desire to fix what is wrong with naturalism. And so there's a whole chapter on existentialism. There are two kinds of existentialism. I'm really not going to talk about the theistic one because it's so similar to theism with a couple of directions, that it starts with human beings as opposed to starting with God. But it's largely a Christian worldview. But atheistic existentialism, one of the ways we can see what that means is by assessing it according to those 8 basic questions. And it gives the same kind of answers regarding questions 1, 4, 5, and 7. So it agrees with materialism about what is prime reality, what happens to a person at death, why it's possible to know anything at all, and then what was the last one? 7. And what is the meaning of human history? It agrees with materialism in those ways. Here's where it differs. What is the nature of external reality, the world around us? Yes, it's a closed system of cause and effect, but existentialism, through folks like Sartre and Camus, said, no, we perceive reality both objectively, in the way that we measure and touch and observe and all that, but also subjectively, internally. There's something within us that experiences reality. So that's a major shift from materialism. It's also different in what a human being is. If you experience reality subjectively, and that's real, just as real as the objective reality that heretofore materialism has argued in favor of, well then, you say a human being is totally free to make choices, even as we live in the absurdity of the moment. In fact, existentialism will go to say what defines a human being is the ability to choose, that existence precedes essence. We exist and then we make those decisions that determine who we are. It's a very radical way of looking at the human person. But that's the way the existentialists hold. And then question 6, how do we know what's right and wrong? Well, yes, it agrees that there are human decisions and human constructs, but the existentialist would say we create value. We create ethics when we rebel against the absurdity of life. When we make moral decisions, that is our rebellion against what we know to be false and absurd. And then the last one about the personal life-orienting core commitments. We commit to ourselves. I commit to me. You commit to you. And I recognize, though, in you somehow, and they never are quite clear about how this recognition happens, but that I recognize your subjective reality in you and know that indeed you are a moral agent and you have created yourself into an ethical person rebelling against the absurdity of the cosmos. It sounds like a number of movie plots I think we've come up with. The fact that it's the human being, the rugged individual hero who makes the decision to rebel against the establishment. Yeah, that's all coming from existentialism. I'm not going to sing it, but the Disney movie a few years ago, Frozen, the words to the song, Let It Go, you need to look up those words and see what your children have been singing. That's all I'm going to say about it. It is an existentialist call to battle. No rules. I make my own way. I create myself. So just look that up. Look that up and see, how'd they sneak that in a Disney movie? You put anything with a catchy tune, and we'll sing along. Yeah. So atheistic existentialism believes, along with materialism, there's no God, there's nothing outside us. It's still only what we can determine, but there is a reality within us as people that is subjective, that we are free to choose. And he spends a lot of time on that chapter in Existentialism talking about Camus in his book, The Plague. And there's a reason for that, is because it's almost it's almost a tract, an essay to talk about how existentialism should work. And the heroes are existentialist heroes because they've made their own decisions to go against the absurdity of life. All right. So existentialism, no one talks about being existential anymore much. Not in the way that Sartre and Camus and others did. We now tend to use that word in a little different way. It's like if something is an existential threat, we'll sometimes get that language, like China is an existential threat to the United States. It means it's a threat to our existence. It's not saying that China is a threat to our pursuing the philosophy of existentialism. So you really don't get that language much anymore. What's replaced it is postmodernism. And so when you come to that section, really pay attention to postmodernism, because it attempts to go further than existentialism in fixing things. And so it will combine naturalism with its core tenets in a way that is still, I think, is the predominant way people look at the world today. We're going to repeat it. I have no idea what I said. I think that right now the predominant perspective is a blend of naturalism or materialism and postmodernism. Postmodernism emphasizes things about truth and the nature of truth. There is no truth, which suspiciously sounds like a truth. Yeah, there is no truth, and so it's a truth that I know there is no truth. Anyway, I think that's the dominant view today, some blending of that. Now, how do we evaluate worldviews? I like to ask 5 questions. The first 2 deal with within the view itself, not compared to other views, but just is it consistent internally? Does it contradict itself at points along the way? And every view has some measure of contradiction as humans practice it and attempt to believe it and process it. And so what are those points of contradiction? Is it consistent? Is it largely consistent? And does it make sense? Does it fit together? Does it cohere? Is there a logical kind of order to where it's going? A worldview that isn't jumping all over the place has something to say for itself. Those 2 questions are internal questions you ask about a particular worldview within its own world. You may not believe, for example, you may not really be into Hindu religion, but within the world of Hindu religion, is it consistent? Or are there places of that? We know there's going to be differences from Christian theism. You're not comparing it to Christian theism. You're simply comparing it within its own orbit, its own universe, to what it's like. And so is materialism, and is existentialism consistent? Does it make sense? Does it cohere? For a lot of people, yes, they say it does. The next 2 questions deal with outside categories of thinking. How does it deal with the available evidence? Does it leave out those parts of those bits of evidence that it just simply doesn't want to deal with? Like materialism has a hard time dealing with love. Oh, well, so you don't really talk about it. Don't want much to do with that. That's merely my neurons firing in certain ways that produce that kind of emotion in me. So how does it deal with evidence that is contrary to it? And then how does it compare with other views? And that's where you get to Christian theism versus materialism versus Eastern religion versus, how does it see things in comparison with these other perspectives? And then the last question that I think is so essential, is it livable? Can you construct a life that is halfway livable through this particular perspective? I would argue that materialism and its offshoots like nihilism and to a large measure existentialism fall off the rails on these points, that there are internal inconsistencies. For example, the matter of human free will. To say that it's all determined and we have no moral agency, we're not able to choose. How do those people know? How have they come up with that? What agency permitted them to transcend themselves to come up with the answer to that question? It's like a century ago, there was a perspective that the only knowledge worth having is scientific knowledge. All other knowledge is not knowledge, it's just preferences. Until someone pointed out to the school of analytic philosophy that was not a scientific statement. That's a philosophical statement. And they had no data proving that in the lab. And so that school has gone away. I think materialism has a hard time dealing with a lot of the data. For example, what I just mentioned, if it's not empirically verifiable, it's not true knowledge. Says who? And it doesn't account for its own emphasis on things that are not empirically verifiable. And it fails to deal with a lot of the other kinds of data as well. And I think naturalism and materialism and existentialism, nihilism, all tend to be self-refuting about when it comes to reason and knowledge. Why should I believe them any more than I believe you? I mean, what basis do I have for that? And one of my huge issues with it is that it leads to this purposelessness and meaninglessness. I'm going to preach for a moment, and so I'm warning you. I think one reason for the rapidly climbing rates of problems with mental health, with increase of suicides, all kinds of things that we see in generations today relate to a sense of hopelessness, a loss of hope, a lack of purpose that other times I think have had. And right now we really don't have much of one in the world as currently constructed. And like my little snarky comment, random is as random does. It sounds like something Forrest Gump would have said. But it's true. If it's all random, then why should I take time choosing about anything? And there's no purpose to it, no meaning to it. It's not going to advance anything. I may think it does, and I'm deluding myself in that, according to materialism. And then the last thing, that we can't or won't live by it, and that's Mr. Schlingerland. What a name. The fact that he knows from the philosophy he has bought into and teaches and published books about, that he knows that it ought to say about his daughter that she is just a biological entity, and yet he cannot treat her that way. There's something more to her than that. And the inconsistency of it is something he has just said, I'm going to have to learn to live with. Because I think, and hopefully I'm not trying to say too much about Mr. Slingerland. I've never met him, never had a conversation with him. But I think Romans chapters 1, 2, and 3 say a lot about human beings' willingness to suppress the truth when it is convenient for us. And so I think there's a lot of truth suppressing going on. That's not to say I don't suppress truth. When it's convenient for me to do so, please don't hear me. In fact, if you'd attended, a few of you, I think, were at the Men's Life talk. I talked about that we've all got stuff, and I've got my stuff, and you have your stuff, and my stuff's pretty bad. And I'm not going to tell you all of what my stuff is, but we've all got stuff. And so my stuff is out there, and I'm trying to deal with my stuff. And I think materialism doesn't help me deal with my stuff. Doesn't give me any way to grapple with it. So something tells us that materialism may have aspects to it that are true and important, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And when you try to make it tell the whole story, sometimes this is put in this way, that when you make science into scientism, when you try to do everything, see everything by that lens, that's where things begin to fall apart. All right, are there closing questions you want to ask after my sermon, my ranting? Where is the microphone? Ah, there we go.
Okay, I know we don't have a ton of time, but the second half of the existentialism, the more Christian side.
Okay.
It seems like that is more attractive than the Christian side of deism. Is that just my imagination?
Well, no, there are, Soren Kierkegaard would agree with you wholeheartedly.
Well, and do we like Soren Kierkegaard?
And he was, I don't really
Okay.
know him. He's been dead a while. But no, his...
The only thing that was a little iffy to me was in the question 7, the history as a record of events is uncertain, and the issue with questioning Scripture.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty in theistic existentialism, more so. That's just part of what they've introduced into the process.
But other than that, it seemed like it seemed like there was a lot about it that was attractive.
Well,
Is
there
that
is. That's why that's why it has been a school of thought that I think is within the Christian worldview.
But I was shocked because the first half of that existentialism chapter was so repugnant, and then all of a sudden it turned on a dime, and I was like, oh, well, maybe I have a little existentialism.
Well, and I think in some ways we all do.
Okay.
So that
I don't even know what that means exactly,
yeah, I'm not
but I'm
sure
going
I
to
do
start
either.
using that because that sounds kind of cool to say.
Yeah, I like to use words that I think sound cool, and I have no idea what they mean too. So, but no, there is a lot in favor of Christian existentialism. One of the problems with it is what's called fideism, yet another term. It is an emphasis on faith, and it's in danger of becoming faith in faith rather than faith placed in the object of faith, that is Christ. That's just a quibble that a lot of people have with Christian existentialism.
Kind of more mystical.
Yeah, that's what a little, like I say, it's more of a faith in the fact that I have faith than faith in the fact that I have faith in the God that we know through Jesus Christ. Any other questions? Going once? Twice? Okay. Here we go.
Most of this stuff in the way of naturalism, materialism, and to some extent, obviously postmodernism, but most of that stuff kind of begins to really take grains of salt landing when you start getting into the middle part of the Renaissance, and from that time frame going forward when science really kind of hits its stride.
I think that's true. I think that it really, and much of that was a response of frustration, even repugnance with the Christian church of the day, the Christendom, and the flaws within largely Roman Catholicism. The same things that provoked much of the Reformation also provoked this. They just tried to solve it, deal with it in some different ways.
One other quick question. We've talked a lot about some other, maybe it's in here earlier, talked a lot about Karl Barth. And so that author was not exactly kind to place him in the theistic existentialism.
Yeah, I didn't like what he did with Karl Barth either.
Yeah, okay.
I like Karl Barth, even though he has some issues in his personal life that have only come to light in the past few years, well after his passing. One of those kinds of things. But I didn't. I'm more of a fan of Karl Barth than our author is.
Yeah, that caught me off guard. I was reading that and suddenly I was just like,
Yeah. Other comments or questions?